Welcome to Cary Open, a podcast where we open a window into the world of Cary Baptist College. This episode is a recording from our chapel gathering called Karakia.
What would be the one word you would use to describe Solomon? Wise, right? Wisdom. Solomon in the Bible is known as kind of a simple, one-trick pony kind of a guy. He's famous for one thing, and it's being super wise. And we are in the text, 1 Kings 2 and 3, where we learn initially about Solomon's wisdom. But I think we should look at this wisdom a bit more closely. Because when you think of wisdom, you could think of kind of like abstract, philosophical, guru on the mountain, the esoteric kind of wisdom. That's actually obviously not the kind of wisdom Solomon asks for. The kind of wisdom Solomon asks for is wisdom related to justice. It's on the text like 3 times. Just look. He says, what I want is an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this great people of yours? This is the language of wisdom for the purpose of judging God's people justly. A wise heart that can judge justly. This is exactly how God interprets Solomon's request. He is pleased that Solomon has asked for yourself understanding to discern or to judge or to decide what is right, or we could just as well say what is just. It's just wisdom, or wisdom oriented towards justice, that Solomon demonstrates the first thing he does when he gets up from the dream in this business with these 2 women. Everybody knows that justice requires you to get the right baby to the right mom. The problem is, how do you get there? And Solomon's wisdom is amazing because he's able to figure out how to do justice, cleverly getting the right baby to the right woman. And that's why when everybody hears about this, they celebrate. They stood in awe of the king. Why? Because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. So what Solomon asks for isn't just wisdom. It is actually. It's just wisdom. It's wisdom oriented towards justice. And this makes 100% sense, biblically speaking. I mean, just think about Psalm 72, a psalm associated with Solomon. It starts this way. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May the mountains yield prosperity for the people and the hills in righteousness. May the king defend the cause of the poor of the people, give deliverance to the needy, and crush the oppressor. That's another prayer from the king to God with all that justice language, but it's the same request Solomon makes. Give me wisdom to rule well, especially on behalf of the poor. Or take Proverbs, a book that's got Solomon's name at the top of it. Like any good sage, he starts his class with an outline or a syllabus. What's this book all about? This book is for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. So the point of the wisdom that Solomon is interested in, that the Bible is interested in, is in the first order, wisdom oriented towards justice. Wisdom and justice go together like peanut butter and jelly, like bacon and eggs. They are 2 sides of the same coin. Now, if you had to divide them out, if you're talking about a person, I think justice is, as John Goldingay puts it, mostly about the faithful exercise of power in community. And I would add, especially on behalf of the orphan and the immigrant and the outsider and the poor. And if you're thinking about structural justice, you're talking about a community that arranges power faithfully, especially on behalf of the orphan and the widow and the immigrant and the poor. Wisdom is the characteristic or the trait or the virtue that we need to know how to actually do that. Justice says power must be faithfully exercised to defend the well-being of the most vulnerable. Wisdom says this is how we're going to make progress towards that in the real world. They go together. And in our text this morning, which we've just read, wisdom and justice go together and are embodied by this king so famous for his wisdom. Except this isn't actually where Solomon's story or the story of Solomon's wisdom begins. And in stories, beginnings are important. I'm on this huge murder mystery binge right now. And there's two kinds of murder mysteries. There's the one where it's the little old lady who's nice the whole time, and then you discover she's somehow gotten herself into a situation where she murders everybody. And the reveals as you go along. But the other is the Columbo style one where you see the killer do it in the opening scene. And the whole fun of it is watching the person you know the killer go through the movement. Beginnings are important. You see that entire film differently if you start knowing that there's a serious issue here than if you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. How does the story of Solomon and the story of Solomon's wisdom begins? Well, that's in 1 Kings 2, and it begins with Solomon standing at his father David's deathbed, receiving David's last words. And this is what David says. Look at 2:1. There's two parts to this. When David's time to die drew near, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. Then the Lord will establish his word that he spoke concerning me, David. If your heirs take heed to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. Man, this is David just about at his best, which is what you want from dudes on their deathbed, right? And you may not notice this, but since I spent 2 years of my life doing nothing but reading Deuteronomy, I can tell you what David is doing is basically quoting Deuteronomy. This is straight Deuteronomy. Torah, God's instruction, is the way to life. Remember, Deuteronomy ends, choose life, right? Follow this God, this way, enter this covenant, and you shall live. And of course, the Torah, the instruction that David's talking about, claims that it unites justice and wisdom in the community. Deuteronomy is dripping with stuff about laws to arrange your business so that they don't oppress or exploit the poor or the land or your animals. Deuteronomy is dripping with laws about how you welcome the orphan and the immigrant. And Deuteronomy says that following these laws will be your wisdom before all the peoples. This is amazing. Maybe Solomon's story is off to a good start. Not so fast. Because David, with his last breath, has this awful Dr. Jekyll to Mr. Hyde moment. Do you remember Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Dr. Jekyll's this really nice doctor guy, but then at night sometimes he turns into Mr. Hyde, who's like a murder guy, and he gets out there and does terrible things. Same person, they shift back and forth. And in the next little bit, David shifts directly, it's on a dime, from the Dr. Jekyll, follow the covenant, walk in the way of Torah, to the Mr. Hyde of violence. Because what he does is he offers Solomon a series of people that Solomon needs to kill in the early days of his regime. It begins this way. Moreover, think about this. It's like Torah, 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 justice, 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 God, God, God. Moreover, you know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me. Act according to your wisdom, but don't let his gray head go down to Sheol in peace. This is bloodthirsty stuff. This is real Godfather, make him an offer you can't refuse kind of stuff. This is ugly. Now, some of you might know the story of Joab, and you might say, oh, but he was kind of a jerk. And David says that. You know, he killed those people in innocent blood. And you think, oh, David, maybe he's being pious after all. Garbage! Joab, yeah, his hands were bloody because he was David's hitman. And do you know when this thing that David claims Solomon needs to deal with Joab happened? 2 Samuel 3. We've got 20 chapters of biblical story in which David has been the king, mind you. Never bothered to bring this up with Joab. He's in charge of justice. He could have thrown him in the prison. He could have executed him. He could have done his job. But no, he profits off this violent hitman. And then on his deathbed, he has the audacity to start talking about piety and wrongs. And here it is for the first time in the book, wisdom. What kind of wisdom is this? In its first occurrence. It's Mr. Hyde, Godfather, take control, smite my enemies kind of wisdom. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the kind of Torah covenant justice that David starts out with, or that Solomon prays for. You see, if faithfulness is how the covenant works, from David's perspective, conniving control through violence is how the world works. And faithfulness is fine as far as it goes, but it's got to be paired, David says to Solomon, with this kind of brutal disregard for God's way in favor of worldly wisdom. What we're seeing here on David's deathbed is this ripping apart of what God has joined asunder, an attempt to separate justice and wisdom. And this is a temptation I think we all face. Sometimes we really want to follow God. We want to care for the poor. We want to welcome the outsider. We want to live lives of self-sacrifice. But ask yourself, when the chips are down, when your back's against the wall, when it comes to the actual business of running your life, or your church, or your household, or your workplace, is it not easy for you, as it is for me, to fall into a kind of, oh, that's just the way things are approach, a kind of worldly wisdom that is so often self-serving and often others abandoning and occasionally even others exploiting? Maybe you don't feel seen by this text, but I certainly do. We are tempted to separate wisdom from justice, but wisdom without justice, cleverness, skill, awareness of how the world works without justice inevitably becomes predatory. Even with the best of intentions. I spent 12 years in Memphis living in you'd call it a decile 1 community. And I used to be so mad at the landlords, the slumlords, these terrible, awful, bad guys out there, and they're profiting off the poor. And it was easy to quote Amos at them, and I would get enraged. And I was basically right about all of that, by the way. But at one stage, some friends and I decided we were going to help another friend become a homeowner, which meant that temporarily we were her landlord. And all of a sudden I discovered it takes a lot more than slogans and shouting to figure out how to do justice in the housing market. It actually requires wisdom, and actually came pretty close to being a bad landlord on some days. And I felt what it feels like when you're going, I have to pay back the guys who lent us the money and I have to hopefully not lose that money, and I have to figure out how to repair this all in real time. And all of a sudden, what I needed was not just what I needed was just wisdom. Because wisdom without justice becomes predatory. And of course, what that story also shows is that justice without wisdom becomes powerless. It didn't matter that I had the slogans if I didn't know how to get it done. Our lives are complicated, and there are rarely easy answers. But the kind of just wisdom that we see Solomon exercise in chapter 3, the kind of just wisdom celebrated in Proverbs, Psalm 72, in Deuteronomy, it calls us to a kind of allegiance to God and to God's way that is rigorously committed to God's justice, and yet nevertheless knows how to make real progress wisely towards those goals in our broken world. But it's far easier to tear wisdom and justice apart. And tragically, that's exactly what happens in Solomon's story. You see, before we're told in the passage we heard read that Solomon loves God and pleads for just wisdom, we're told about Solomon brutally executing his political adversaries, mostly with more or less acceptable excuses. Before we ever hear about Solomon's love for God and his plea for wisdom, we hear about Solomon marrying Pharaoh's daughter, which Deuteronomy would have found dubious on multiple accounts, not least Deuteronomy's worry that kings would try to become emperors by building political alliances through marriage and eventually exalt themselves above the people and exploit those under them. And of course, after in chapter 3, we see Solomon bringing just wisdom together in this brief moment. We see just wisdom again torn apart. As Solomon not only marries Pharaoh's daughter, he makes many political alliances, almost countless political alliances, and these political alliances lead him to both act like an oppressive ruler, at least according to 1 Kings 12, Solomon acted a lot like a Pharaoh from Egypt in the way he required labor on all his building projects. And they led Solomon to commit grievous injustice against God, because all of these political alliances through these marriages lead Solomon to idolatry, all kinds of idolatry even to the one God who every single place he shows up everywhere else in the Bible is associated with child sacrifice. Justice without wisdom is powerless, but wisdom without justice becomes predatory. And when these things drift in Solomon's life, the results are disastrous. So what do we make of the just wisdom in the middle, in that lovely chapter that we read? I think we are seeing a genuine glimpse of the character God wants from us, especially in our exercise of power. Solomon really does seem to come close to something that God calls all of us to, and especially our leaders. After all, for that woman who was at risk of losing her son, the difficult, complex, messy work of just wisdom, even when exercised by a very imperfect king, made a real difference. That's true for us. As we look at our own lives, not least in as much as we are leaders, this is a message we need to hear. God invites us to embrace a kind of discipleship that is pursuing this kind of just wisdom, a path that leads to life rather than death, a kind of wisdom that helps us to discern how to faithfully exercise power in our time and place, in our moment, in our position, especially on behalf of the orphan and the widow and the immigrant and the socially excluded and the outsider. And the story even points us to some of the sources for this wisdom. David, when he wants to talk about real justice, he goes to Deuteronomy. If we want just wisdom, the scriptures are there for us. Solomon, when he really wants just wisdom, he goes to God in prayer. As James puts it, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask. Ultimately, as Christians, we know better than Solomon did that just wisdom is a gift of the Spirit of God, the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead, that is at work in us, if we will but walk in step with that Spirit. And Solomon's story reminds us that there are real, serious, tragic, devastating costs when God's people divide the wisdom and justice the Scripture calls us to hold together. When we embrace worldly wisdom divorced from justice, when we're clever but not committed to God's way, in the way we run our churches, the way we organize our economic lives, in the way we manage our families and sexual practices, in the way we engage politically, we do real harm. Every time we kind of set aside the world God calls us to and say, the world just really isn't like that. Of course you got to do what you got to do. Of course you got to, in those moments, we risk tearing wisdom and justice apart, and our wisdom becomes predatory. And at other times, Christians have been guilty of retreating into a form of witness characterized primarily by shouting or TikToking or posting or Instaing or whatever the kids are doing these days, which I have to say now that I'm 40 and am officially unhip. The point is, we can easily think as Christians, our witness is done when we've told the world what things should be like. And that is a part of it. That speaking truth, that declaring, that is a part of it. But what Solomon's story, what Proverbs, what Deuteronomy calls us to, what Jesus calls us to, I think, is to go beyond the shouting to ask, how do we cultivate the kind of wisdom and experience and skills necessary to make real progress in a world that is messy? Because otherwise, we're tempted to withdraw, to get above the fray, to back out, to abandon the field in favor of the, much purer space where we can keep our hands clean and keep shouting without getting into the real work. This story warns us about all of that, and I think that is one way that it is given to us for our instruction, as Paul says, is to warn us about what happens when we separate what God has joined together. But more importantly still, I think, this story of Solomon's complicated relationship to wisdom and justice, we must remember, is held inside a bigger story that David knew part of and told Solomon about, a story that began with God making covenantal promises way back there in Deuteronomy. And all of 1st and 2nd Kings is going to say, remember the covenant. If you choose life, blessing will come. If you choose death, cursing will come. And all of 1st and 2nd Kings is going to remind us what Deuteronomy said. This people have gone wrong and curses will come. But kings may also know that that's not how Deuteronomy ended. No, Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah, says, even if you break my way, even if you suffer all the worst consequences of your own behavior, even then, even if you burn down your side of the covenantal house, then I, Yahweh, will do a new thing. I will act in a new way. I will rescue and transform my people and give them a new heart so that they can walk in my way faithfully. In other words, Deuteronomy knows that on the other side of covenant death is new covenant life. And I think there's a chance the authors of 1st and 2nd Kings know enough to know that their story is a story of covenant death, but that is open to a new move of covenant life. Whether they did or not, we who read this story surely know that the God we worship is a God who loves to raise the dead, a God who loves to bring life where death has reigned. We know that because we have seen the king we are waiting for. Not David, not Solomon, not any of other kings, but great David's greater son, the one of whom Jesus said of himself, one greater than Solomon is here, the one who embodies in his own life all power exercised faithfully on behalf of others, and all wisdom ushering all of creation wisely towards his purposes. If we hear this story from the standpoint of Easter, then we know this text is inviting us to come to Jesus, to come to the wise, just king our hearts long for, and then to beg that wise, just king to so lavishly send his Spirit that you and I become people who faithfully embody the just wisdom we were made for and in which our King so delights.
The Baptist NZ Podcast Network.